another example of Rumsfeld's contributions to the nation in his time as defense secretary. Shortly after 9/11, President Bush used religious language to describe the struggle that the U.S. was engaged in.
And the American people are beginning to understand. This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while.
You can see the look on Laura's face there. He says, "This crusade," and she goes, I don't think he's supposed to say that. This crusade. Yeah. Now, although Rumsfeld himself wasn't particularly demonstratively religious, Rumsfeld took that crusade idea and ran with it. He began presenting the war as a crusade in his daily intelligence briefings, the Secretary of Defense's Worldwide Intelligence Update, which was presented to the president and a very small group of high-ranking officials every day. This, for example, was the cover page from April 11th, 2003. It features a picture of a group of soldiers praying underneath the biblical verse, "Seek the Lord and his strength, seek his face continually." From April 8th, 2003, a picture of Baghdad's Hands of Victory arch with the biblical caption, "Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the nation that keeps faith." And from April 1st, here's a soldier on patrol outside Baghdad with the caption, "Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and your plans will succeed." Those cover pages, which were only distributed to a dozen or so senior officials, were passed on to Robert Draper and now grace the pages of his report in GQ magazine. They may have been the fast way into the heart of the president, who loved to quote the Bible. Imagine the implications if those had leaked to the press at the time. Joining us now is Robert Draper. He's a journalist and correspondent for GQ magazine. He's also author of the book Dead Certain, The Presidency of George W. Bush. Mr. Draper, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Pleasure to be on, Rachel.
First of all, those intelligence briefings, those cover sheets we just showed, those were only circulated to about a dozen senior Bush administration officials. So am I right in inferring that whoever saved these all this time and passed them on to you has to be a pretty senior level official?
If I told you who it was, I'd never eat lunch in this town again, Rachel, so I can't say. What I can tell you is that it wasn't an individual who's a so-called disgruntled ex-employer who was marginalized by Rumsfeld. It was not an individual who had a particular bone in that regard to pick.
And you do describe your sources for this piece as Bush loyalists, and you had incredibly high-placed sources, including many interviews with the president himself for the biography that you did of the president. This is, in fact, a comparatively flattering portrait of Bush when you compare him to Rumsfeld. His worst failing sort of in this telling is that he didn't fire Donald Rumsfeld. Do you think that there is an agenda among Bush loyalists to sort of shove some of the blame for the administration's failings onto Rumsfeld?
No, it's a fair question to ask, and any journalist has to do what they can to divine the motives of the people who are giving them information. But the people who talked to me, though, a lot of them didn't exactly like Rumsfeld, and I think this is a particularly salient issue because Rumsfeld had a facility for incurring so much enmity with people. Nonetheless, I think these people were not preoccupied with their own legacy. They were preoccupied with the president's legacy, and their concern was that Rumsfeld, far from aiding and abetting that legacy, had undermined it.
One of the things that you document in this article is a major role for Donald Rumsfeld during Hurricane Katrina. Can you describe what your sources told you about his role in the response to Katrina?
Sure. Basically what it came down to was this, that in the days following the landfall of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and particularly when there began to be this perception that New Orleans was in a lawless state, a perception that to some degree was unfounded, but which nonetheless was a perception held by relief workers, bus drivers who were afraid to come into the city. There was a real hue and cry among members of the administration to get boots on the ground in New Orleans, to get active duty troops, specifically to supplement the 50,000 or so National Guard troops who were there. Rumsfeld resisted this. He did not want to commit troops there, and he threw up roadblocks whenever possible. As one official explained it to me, even though the president kept asking questions, Don, how we can do this, it was as if Rumsfeld was demanding that Bush find the right key to put in the keyhole, the right question to ask. And it ultimately got to a point where the president pretty much had to demand by Saturday, several days after landfall, for Rumsfeld to bring in troops. But it was a lot of obstructions that Rumsfeld was throwing up, and it was quite unusual. At a period of time that was clearly a domestic crisis, when the administration needed all hands on deck, Rumsfeld was not there.
One of the things that is sort of the legacy of the Bush administration around the issue of the Pentagon is how the Pentagon, especially under Donald Rumsfeld, sort of grew to take over so many other previously civilian functions of government. And so we think of Donald Rumsfeld as this bureaucratic expansionist, sort of taking over everything, sidelining agencies outside the Pentagon, building parallel structures within the Pentagon to duplicate the work of other agencies. That's hard to square with that view of him during Katrina, in which he was essentially shirking Department of Defense responsibility and hoping somebody else would deal with it.
I think maybe to be charitable to the Secretary, his point of view was that the Pentagon, the military, had a particular role, and others should not encroach on that role. We have to remember, of course, that there were 2 wars being waged during this time, and he was very hesitant to provide troops for a domestic situation. Nonetheless, it was one in which they were clearly needed, according to members of the administration. The president felt that way himself, and he didn't come out and say, "Mr. President, I think it's wrong for us to commit troops." He just simply threw up roadblocks and gave one explanation after the next, which a number of individuals viewed as tantamount to giving the president the Heisman.
In terms of what will happen next and why this is happening now, do you expect Donald Rumsfeld to sort of come out publicly and defend himself now the way that the former Vice President Dick Cheney has?
Well, he's working on his book now, Rachel, and I expect that he's going to devote his attention to that. There had been a concern amongst a lot of people in the administration, including the president, that the Secretary's book would be a scores-settling kind of book, and perhaps this will give him more impetus to do so. There already have been some members of the Secretary's team who, in op-eds, have defended his legacy, and I expect that they will do so. But I don't think that I mean, this is legacy-building season right now, Rachel. So, I mean, there are a variety of people who, be it in the Pentagon or in the State Department, have book contracts and are doing what they can to write the first draft of the history of this presidency. Rumsfeld will be doing the same thing, but I don't expect him to be full-throated until the book comes out.
And did I catch you right in saying there that the president himself, George W. Bush himself, is concerned about whether or not Rumsfeld's going to be settling some scores in that book?
Not with him. The president had told me during one of my interviews with him for my book that he was concerned that Rumsfeld would go after other individuals, and he hoped that that were not the case. But the president felt like he would be more or less immune, that he had stuck his neck out for the Secretary, had kept him on, indeed, far longer than many, many aides in the West Wing had recommended that Rumsfeld be kept on. So the president's certainly not worried for himself.
Well, I think that after this article, after the publication of this article, I think a lot of people are seeing this now as Bush camp v. Rumsfeld camp. So we'll see if that calculation still holds. Robert Draper, journalist, correspondent for GQ magazine with impeccable sourcing on this stuff. Thank you so much for your time tonight.